What's happening to the people that we as charities work with?
I don't know. This is a projection of, this is income coming in for the councils to spend, and this is the costs associated with provision of their current core function. And at this point, this is when they have less money coming in than they have needs to pay for. So that's the point when they're talking about the councils going bankrupt, if they carry on delivering services and provision in the way they are doing now. So this is the point for a graph of doom. Each local authority has one that has a slightly different point at when the cost of services will exceed. I love this diagram. It's from the King's Fund, a charity, and it's in a 5-minute cartoon that kind of explains in very rapid fire where are you going to complain to the people who commission your service, the people who provide your service, and people are getting lost in the system. So this is just another thing that we need to be aware of because it's going to affect almost everybody today in terms of the stigmatisation of poverty. So they would have lost 68, and then the Midlands would have got £40 more, and the South East would have got £20 more. All the seaside towns along the south coast, when there's lots of more well-off older people, would this spending formula would have had that implication. Now, we're getting at a Greater Manchester level, and that means for us, where do we have to influence? Because if these decisions are being made at a Greater Manchester level, we have less ways to influence at a local level what is going on, and that's something to think about in how we move forward. And also we've got place-based, so instead of going, this is the healthcare budget, this is the social care budget, this is the education budget, looking at total budgets for areas and how they can best resource that. So these are the influences of that going on from commissioning. If it influences what the commissioners are thinking, it's going to influence what they purchase from us. So they encourage collaboration and partnership working. There's around spot purchasing, so instead of paying for whole contracts, I'll turn up saying we want X service for Y person for a short amount of time, and that's going to have to make us think differently about how we finance and charge for our services. Again, they're looking to commission fewer organisations, either with larger contracts or that those fewer organisations will be having, they'll be lead bodies. There's also, they're moving away from a universal offer, so there's far less that's going to be financed through universal offers. They want to target these clients who are, in their words, over-dependent and who cost the most public services.
In the UK can't afford adequate housing, and we know what the impact of the bedroom tax is having on people. I'm involved in a housing association, and we're having to look at what the welfare reforms mean for tenants in terms of people going into rent arrears and what that means. Roughly 40 million people can't afford one or more of the essential household goods. Almost 12 million people are too poor to engage in common social activities that are considered normal and necessary by the majority of the population. About 5.5 million adults go without essential clothing. Around 4 million children and adults are not fed properly by today's standards, and people are having to choose whether they heat their home or they buy food. Almost 4 million children go without at least 2 things that they need, and around 2.5 million live in homes that are damp, and we know what the impact that has in terms of health. And around 1.5 million children live in households that cannot afford to heat their homes. But the figures don't really talk about the personal cost, because we can all, quote statistics. And so, like I said, we asked some of our staff for examples of what this means for the people they work with, and I just wanted to read some of them out. A client and I have been working the client I've been working with is on treatment for hepatitis C, and the side effects of treatment include brain fog, depression and fatigue. He was advised to move from the 3-bedroom house to a 1-bedroom bungalow by his housing association and health visitor. This was a trying time for him, as changing his rent payments from one address to another was not easy, has had to move on a set date.
To support the Greater Manchester Poverty Commission. The meat of the commission for me, and it was part of I would put in shaping the commission, was to hear from people across Greater Manchester who have personal experience of poverty. We are facing nationally a triple unprecedented crisis, economic crisis, the deepest and longest recession we've had for 70 years. The biggest fall in living standards, again, for 50, 60, 70 years, which started before the economic crisis. The drop in living standards actually predated the economic crash, and those people that kind of are into forecasts reckon that it will continue for a whole decade. And the third one is then the record austerity. And the impact of those three, the recession, the fall in living standards, and austerity and spending cuts, is the context that we're operating in, obviously, in Manchester. But it's important that's said. Manchester, on the last figures, 2010, was the fourth most deprived city in the UK. But also, I haven't got the figures, probably was also the second, third or fourth wealthiest city. You can walk around the city centre and there is plenty of money still out there. We are a divided city, and the issue of inequality, I think, is one that we need to address. And one of the issues is the stigma attached to poverty. But 4 ways of understanding poverty. Poverty is having a lack of choice. Not being able to choose what you eat, where you live, what you buy, where you go. Poverty is all-encompassing. Poverty is a kind of visceral experience.
In terms of what's happening in welfare reform, it's pretty well documented, and I started making a list of all the things that were going on, and so we had the bedroom tax, work capability assessments, and in fact it is really just a way of targeting reducing funding for poor people. What we want to do is say, no, they can't have that, the idea of undeserving poor and deserving poor. So I was thinking about, well, where did it originate? How did this happen? We've lost an argument, and that's probably why we want to talk about welfare reform in the workshop when I do it later. I think we lost the argument because we stopped looking at it for people where we're actually responsible for the state we find ourselves in, and we found some convenient scapegoats, and people have been pushed in that agenda fairly hard. So it's not hard to see that migrants, particularly immigrants, being targeted as being the cause of the situation we find ourselves in. The undeserving poor, worklessness, people who like as if somehow this is a choice that people are making, that actually you're going to choose to be workless and living on benefit system, and that's the message that's being sold. There's some interesting stuff that welfare reform's introducing, the wholesale changes to the universal credit introduction and how that's working. I think some people, it's arguable, I think it's probably due. It was about time that that bit got sorted out, but using that as an excuse to reduce the cost for government whilst actually transferring all the liabilities onto us as taxpayers seems to be a little bit rich. We can't rebuild the master's house using the master's tool. So some of the stuff that we're looking at actually requires us to stop thinking about how we do what we're currently doing. The idea that co-production will solve all our problems, which is another drive, another issue. I think the politicians work for me, because I think it's me who pays their wages. So I think there's something to be said about these reforms. But looking at things like the work capability assessment and targeting people with disabilities and saying, because you've got a capability that somehow that makes you more eligible for work, less eligible for the receipt of benefit, with notwithstanding all the advantages that were gained in having those particular things, we're kind of sort of going on with it because there are clear examples of where equality has been sidelined and we've moved to something called fairness. But by any measure, what's happening under welfare reform is not fair. It's certainly not fair to the majority of people I know, certainly not fair to a lot of people in the city of Manchester.
So you have no sick pay rights or anything, so you don't get paid for travelling between appointments. So 10 minutes is actually, I would
April this year, I set up a page on Facebook, following up my own, around all the changes around health and well-being, and health watch.
PIA.org.uk. And the fringe meetings are at 12:40 and 2:10 Tuesday the 1st of October at London Scottish Woods.
It's not a case of saying here all the issues that involved, but let's work.
Children don't get enough food to eat, their brain development is affected. When children don't get enough love and attention from their parents, their emotional development is affected. When children see their parents arguing and desperate because money's so tight, because the job that the father is in is low paid, the job that the mother is in is 0 hours contracts, children are hurt. And we have a generation of children growing up, a lost generation, whose psychological, social, emotional, intellectual well-being is being attacked